Hello and welcome to Talking Business as we join you all around the world. This week it's the turn of Iran's economy to be under our microscope because its status as the world's seventh biggest oil producer should be a source of great wealth. So why is its economy struggling badly? And, in fact, why has it been doing so for years? As we've recently been reminded, Iran's nuclear program has been at the centre of that struggle. It's triggered financial sanctions, as well as the recent war with Israel and fighting with the United States. It's brought devastating economic sanctions that could yet pose the biggest threat to the survival of the regime that has led the Islamic Republic since 1979. The BBC isn't often allowed to report from inside Iran, so it isn't easy to get an accurate reflection of how regular citizens feel about the economic situation. But we did get these thoughts from people in Tehran back in March. They were filmed by the West Asia News Agency and provided by our trusted partner, Reuters.
Due to the currency and dollar fluctuations, people's economic conditions have become difficult for them, and they cannot get everything they want from the market.
Given the economic conditions we're currently facing, there is some pressure on all segments of society. We all feel this pressure to a greater or lesser extent.
Given the sanctions, downsizings and economic conditions, not only the market, but also everything else is in a bad state. In these financial conditions, people can't afford to buy things.
Look, the economic situation, there are always problems, but I personally am not very ungrateful or unhappy because I believe that sustenance and our ability to survive is in God's hands.
So why are people feeling downbeat about their livelihoods? Iran's economy is hard to measure, but this graph shows how sanctions in 2011 and 2018 had a big impact on growth, which has only just recovered, despite the population growing to 92 million people. Over time, it has become harder for Iranians to make ends meet. Household spending in big cities is down 30% since its 2008 peak, and in rural areas it is down more than 50%. One reason people have less money to spend is that less people are working. That's partly because less women are working due to government restrictions. Another big problem is inflation. The latest official numbers show prices for goods and services rising at a yearly rate of a whopping 34.5%, fueled by mismanagement of the public finances and international isolation. And in a speech in March, Iran's Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei acknowledged as much.
Yes, sanctions are not entirely without effect, but it isn't the case that if our economic situation is bad, it's only due to sanctions. No, our own negligence sometimes has an effect. And not just sometimes, most of our problems stem from our own negligence.
And a large part of that is how the huge sums Iran makes from selling oil are used. Billions are being spent on weapons for itself and regional allies, as well as on Iran's nuclear program and the government's security forces. That money has flowed in despite sanctions, as Iran pumped more oil and other energy last year than it had done since before the Islamic Revolution in 1979. And although export income is nowhere near the pre-sanctions peak, it has risen in recent years and now brings in around $78 billion a year. How? Well, the vast majority is going to China, despite Western sanctions, that President Trump had considered lifting.
I'm for stopping Iran, very simply, from having a nuclear weapon. They can't have a nuclear weapon. I want Iran to be great and prosperous and terrific.
We did try asking for an interview with Iran's recently appointed finance minister and the governor of the central bank, but we didn't get any response. And as it's so difficult for anyone inside Iran to speak to the BBC, instead we turned to an Iranian economist who monitors the country closely. He's at the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies. Mahdi Godsi, welcome to the show.
Hello, thank you for the invitation.
I want to begin by asking you how Iranians are coping day to day with soaring inflation that means goods and services there are costing roughly 40% more each year.
Yes, so since 6 years ago, when President Donald Trump in his first term in office withdrew the US from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action and imposed crippling secondary sanctions on the Iranian economy, since then, inflation is hovering around 40%. And it was a very high inflation because prior to that, it was less than 20%. And since 6 years ago, unfortunately, because of the austerity measures that were introduced by President Raisi, the real income of employees, public employees, minimum wages in Iran have decreased by about 50%. And this is what Iranians are suffering from. And this means a huge amount of pressure on their household income, on their costs, so they cannot spend as much as before.
But when we talk about Iranians coping from day to day, how bad is it getting for people in their daily lives?
There is not enough food on the shelves of shops. And because of supply shortages, that is coming actually because truckers strike about 2 months ago that it started. So there is a huge supply bottlenecks and prices are increasing and increasing.
People may wonder, why isn't the government, though, managing to keep prices, wages and jobs under control with an economy growing at 3% a year?
Yes, the economy is growing, it's still growing, and so much of this growth is due to increased oil exports that was being facilitated at the time of the Biden administration, who turned blind eye on Iran's exports of oil to China, to Malaysia, to India. So there was some growth, but the growth was not in other sectors of economy. About 70-80% of Iran's gross domestic product is going to Iran's public budget. Iran is dependent on lots of intermediate and primary commodities, foodstuffs, pharmaceuticals that are being imported from outside. And if Iranian government continues to devalue its own currency, it means that prices of these imported goods would again continue to rise.
Is it not only the lack of both an independent central bank, but also a lack of investment in badly needed infrastructure like electricity and water, which has shortages of both? Are those exacerbating the problem?
Of course, lack of investment in the past, let's say, decade, or even since 2011, since 2012, when the sanctions intensified, the business environment in Iran has never been good. And due to that, investment has been declining. So infrastructure is becoming rusty. And the Iranian government does not manage to supply enough utility, energy, electricity, even water in certain periods. So given all of this, lack of private investment, lack of public investment, the situation and the living standards are not being improved.
It's surprising because on the face of it, a country that is the world's 7th biggest oil producer should be wealthy and thriving. So where is the estimated $78 billion from oil sold abroad last year going?
Because of sanctions, because of mismanagement of the government, because we're dealing here with an autocracy that tries to conceal information that is not transparent. We don't know exactly how much of it is going through different commodities and products. So some parts of it, some parts of Iranian export is being transferred to imports of commodities like foodstuffs, like livestock feed, like medicine, pharmaceuticals. These commodities are not targeted by sanctions, so that's how Iranian government can still import these goods.
Are there any estimates as to how much of that money would be spent on weapons or Iran's nuclear program?
So there's some estimates that the cost of building the nuclear facilities in Iran in the past decades was reaching more than $1 trillion, but there's no tacit information, there's no transparent information regarding these issues. But what we know that there has been always a covert support of the Iranian regime for proxies, for its nuclear program, for its missile activity. We believe that a huge amount of Iranian export revenues are going to these costs.
Iran's supreme leader has suggested that many of the economic problems are homegrown rather than caused by sanctions. He's urged Iranians to buy more homemade goods to help the economy recover. But are domestic solutions the answer, or are sanctions still the greatest threat that they need to overcome?
A regime that is ruled by ideology, by Islamists in its capital, it does not pursue expertise to provide enough knowledge, technology for its own domestic production. There is no internal source of growth and development in Iran. On the other hand, technology that is developed in different parts of the world is heavily needed in Iran. And because of sanctions, there is no access to such technology. So both domestic and foreign relationship of Iranian government have led to the situation in which Iran cannot develop.
Finally, Mahdi, is the struggling economy getting so bad it's becoming the biggest threat to the survival of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei's regime?
That's one of the factors, of course. So economic conditions are the ones that could push the society to the streets again, and they could ask for change. But I think the Iranian society needs a coalition of leaders to guide them and mobilize them. And those leaders are within and outside Iran. They just need to come to alliance.
Mahdi Godsi, it's been great to have you on the programme. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So that's the picture of what's happening inside Iran. But there's pressure coming from the outside too, thanks to financial sanctions. So to understand more, I've been speaking to a man who has held various US government positions under Presidents Obama and Biden. He played a large role in drawing up sanctions on Iran and is now at Columbia University in New York. Richard Nephew, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much for having me.
I want to begin by asking you, what sanctions is Iran currently under and what's the aim of them?
So Iran is under pretty comprehensive U.S. sanctions. Our U.S. sanctions cover both trade between Iran and the United States, as well as Iran and the rest of the world. And essentially they work by the U.S. threatening the rest of the world. If you do business with Iran we don't like, you can't do business inside the United States. Iran's also under some limited sanctions from other countries, but most of it comes down to U.S. sanctions.
And what are they aiming to achieve?
The objective of U.S. sanctions is generally to try and change Iranian policy, either as it relates to the nuclear program, missile program, its regional activities, so support for groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis in Yemen, those sorts of groups that the U.S. has concerns with. Sanctions are also focused on human rights, they're treating their own people. And so U.S. sanctions are intended to change those kinds of policies into a direction that we think make more sense either for international security or for the safety and security of the Iranian people.
And how effective are they proving? Because Iran's economy has been growing for the last 5 years and it benefited from $78 billion from oil exports last year.
Yeah, sanctions are leaky. I think the reality is that sanctions are never going to be as waterproof as people think they are, that there's always going to be some ability for smuggling activity or evasion to take place. Chinese are willing to continue doing this business, and the United States has been unwilling to go after Chinese banks and other financial entities that might change some of that decision making. So there's a lot of leaks, and the Iranians are benefiting from that, although, of course, not to the extent that they would be if there were no sanctions in place at all.
But how effective are they? I mean, why has the US Treasury added more sanctions on oil purchases and transportation this month? Is it another sign that they've just not been effective enough so far?
Well, the funny thing about sanctions is I think there's sometimes an impression that you impose them and then everything's done. But sanctions maintenance is as big a task as the imposition of sanctions in the first place. And that's because the party that is being sanctioned takes steps to evade those sanctions. So the Iranians are every day trying to find new ways around the sanctions because, of course, they would like to be able to sell oil. They would like to be able to make money. They have a national interest in being able to do so as well, which does mean that you have to continue to apply attention, effort, intelligence resources, and similar to the task of trying to close those loopholes and work to make them as effective as possible.
Recently, Iran's threat to close the Strait of Hormuz spooked oil markets. But can the world live without Iranian oil? And would closing the straits actually have been too costly for Iran in terms of losing its own oil exports?
The world can live without Iranian oil exports. At this point, Iran is exporting around 1.5 million barrels per day of oil. That is easy to make up within the global market that we've got. The problem is the Strait of Hormuz doesn't just simply control Iranian oil exports, but also oil that would be coming from other countries on the Persian Gulf. And there are ways to try and bypass it. Those ways are less efficient, they're more costly, and they're not as effective in moving oil as just simply putting it on a boat and moving it through the Straits of Hormuz.
So why did they blink then? Was it because they wanted to hold on to their own export money?
First, there is an impact on their own ability to generate export revenue through the sale of their oil. But second, there's a high risk that it would escalate the conflict. The Iranians can close the Straits of Hormuz, but they probably can't keep them closed. The United States Navy, working with partners, has practiced for years reopening the straits, including minesweeping activity that would eliminate Iran's ability to keep the straits closed. And so if you're going to make that kind of decision, you have to be sure that it is worth the cost that you're going to bear.
Why does China consistently risk buying Iranian oil, which funds fighting of the US and Israel, when there is spare capacity elsewhere?
I think the Chinese perspective has long been that they would like to be able to have a positive transactional relationship with every country in the Middle East. It behooves their broader political agenda, and they know that if they had to have that curtailed, they could live without. Thus far, the Chinese have been calling the U.S. bet, and the U.S. simply hasn't stood up to it. There's no indication that the Chinese are making significant, sustained cuts in their purchases of Iranian oil. Frankly, they've been maintaining around 1 to 1.5 million barrels per day of purchases for a couple of years now, and I don't see any chance that that's going to change without some kind of stimulus from the United States.
So is it a case of the US issuing hollow threats to China? And if so, why?
I think the United States has issued threats to China that it would really rather not take. Certainly, the U.S. has imposed sanctions on Chinese banks in the past. Bank of Kunlun back in 2012 is a clear example. The United States imposed significant sanctions on the bank, precluding it from having any access to the United States. I think the Chinese recognize that there is that risk that the United States would act again. It's part of the reason why I don't think that these threats are hollow. But there is also significant risk that comes to the United States from having Chinese financial institutions under sanctions, especially in the context of the global trade environment and the desire on the part of the Trump administration to try and improve trade ties.
If there is sanctions relief, could that open the Iranian market up to foreign companies? And could that happen in the next few months, the next few years? And what would that mean for Iran's economy?
I think that if there was a deal and if it included extensive sanctions relief, there would still be a lot of difficulty in getting business into Iran. There remain security issues, there remain cultural issues, there remain suspicions about expropriation and those sorts of things that the Iranian state may engage in. There are still reputational concerns with being associated with a government that chants death to the U.S., death to Israel, that supports groups that have aid terrorist attacks on U.S. interests, Israeli interests, European interests, for many years. It would require a lot of leaps of faith by big banks and by big companies, and thus far we've not seen them. If that all took place, I am absolutely convinced that the Iranian economy could expand significantly. The reality is that Iran has a large population, a well-educated population, and after years of economic deprivation, and a motivated population to also make the most of these opportunities. It's just a question of whether or not all the non-economic issues can be addressed to make that a reality.
Richard Nephew, it's been great having you on the show. Thank you.
Thank you very much.